All right, today we're diving into a case that was, no joke, the first big test for liberty in a newly independent India. We're talking about the A.K. Gopalan case. This wasn't just some dry legal argument. It was a showdown that pitted one man's freedom against the security of a brand new nation. It really forced the question, just how much power should the state have over you? Let's get into it. So let's just start with a question that cuts right to the chase. Can you be locked up without actually committing a crime? Just because the government thinks you might cause trouble? This isn't some philosophy class puzzle. It's the very real power of preventative detention, and it's the tool that put A.K. Gopalan behind bars and sparked a constitutional firestorm. So to really get how this all played out, we're going to walk through 5 key parts. First, we'll meet the leader who was detained. Then we'll see how liberty itself was put on trial. We'll look at the court's pretty controversial decision, and then we'll focus on the one dissenting voice who kind of saw the future. And finally, we'll trace the long journey from this case to another one that changed everything, Maneka Gandhi. Okay, so let's set the scene. You've got 2 major forces on a collision course, a very prominent communist leader on one side and the government of a newly independent India on the other. So who was this guy, A.K. Gopalan? Well, he was no stranger to a jail cell. As a founding leader of the Communist Party, the British had thrown him in prison multiple times for his political activities. But what made this time different, in 1950, was who was doing the jailing. It wasn't a colonial power anymore. It was the government of free India, using a brand new, powerful law, the Preventive Detention Act. So, what exactly is preventive detention? Think of it this way. It's not about punishing someone for a crime they've already committed. It's about locking them up without a trial because the state is afraid of what they might do in the future. It's an incredible amount of power for any government to have. And you have to ask, why did the government feel they needed this power? Well, you've got to remember the context. We're in the early 1950s. The Cold War is raging. The Indian government was genuinely worried about communist uprisings and violent movements, like the armed struggle that had just happened in Telangana. It was really in this climate of fear that the Preventive Detention Act was passed. So, with Gopalan detained, the fight moves from the streets into the courtroom. And this becomes the first major battleground for India's shiny new constitution and all its promises of fundamental rights. Gopalan took his case straight to the Supreme Court. He argued that his detention was like a domino effect that knocked down all his fundamental rights. He said, "Look, by taking away my personal liberty under Article 21, you're also illegally crushing my freedom of speech and my freedom to move around under Article 19. His whole point was that these rights are all connected, and this act was just an arbitrary way to violate them all at once. And the entire case really boiled down to the meaning of these 4 words in Article 21, procedure established by law. What did they actually mean? 2 totally different ideas emerged. Gopalan's lawyers argued it meant that any procedure had to be fair, just, and reasonable. But the state's argument was much simpler and, honestly, a bit chilling. They said, procedure just means whatever law Parliament passes. Whether it's fair or not, they said, isn't for the court to decide. So the Supreme Court had to make a choice, and its decision would end up defining personal liberty in India for the next 3 decades. And when the verdict came down, it was a massive blow to Gopalan's case. By a powerful 6-1 majority, the Supreme Court sided with the state. The Preventive Detention Act was upheld, and so was Gopalan's detention. So how on earth did they reach this conclusion? Well, this is where it gets really fascinating. The court came up with what we now call the compartmentalization theory. They basically decided that each fundamental right, like freedom of movement in Article 19 and personal liberty in Article 21, lives in its own separate, sealed-off little box. They said they weren't connected at all. So here's a breakdown of their logic. First, they put the rights in separate boxes. So if you were detained under a law that targeted Article 21, you couldn't even argue that your Article 19 freedoms were also being hit. Second, they totally agreed with the state's narrow, literal reading of procedure. As long as Parliament passed the law correctly, that was good enough. And the result? The Preventive Detention Act was declared constitutional, except for one tiny procedural section they struck down. But hang on. Remember that 6-1 vote? What about the 1? That single dissenting voice belonged to Justice Fazl Ali. And his opinion, well, it would turn out to be prophetic. Justice Fazl Ali just completely rejected the majority's thinking. He argued that these powerful phrases in our Constitution that guarantee liberty, they aren't just empty words. For him, any procedure that takes away a person's freedom has to be based on principles of natural justice. In other words, it couldn't just be a law, it had to be a fair law. His vision was the total opposite of the majority's. He saw fundamental rights as an interconnected web. An attack on one was an attack on all of them. For him, procedure had to mean a fair and reasonable process, not just any old law that Parliament could cook up. And by that standard, he said the Preventive Detention Act was unconstitutional. For nearly 3 decades, that narrow, restrictive view from the Gopalan case was the law of the land. But Justice Ali's dissent didn't just fade away. It was there, dormant, just waiting for its moment. And that moment would finally come 28 years later. And that moment was the 1978 landmark case of Maneka Gandhi versus the Union of India. In this case, a whole new generation of Supreme Court justices did something huge. They completely overturned the Gopalan verdict, kicking off a brand new era for fundamental rights in India. I mean, this table just captures the revolution perfectly. Where Gopalan saw rights as separate and isolated, Maneka Gandhi said no, they're interconnected and they overlap. Where Gopalan said any procedure passed by Parliament is fine, Maneka Gandhi insisted it must be just, fair, and reasonable. That old, restrictive view of personal liberty was thrown out, and a much more expansive one took its place. And here's the real kicker. The Maneka Gandhi judgment was a complete vindication of Justice Fazl Ali. His lonely dissenting opinion from 1950 finally became the law of the land. The court was essentially saying, you know what? That one judge, he was right all along. So why do we still talk about the Gopalan case? Well, it was the first defining fight over personal liberty in the Supreme Court. It set a precedent that put state power first, and that shaped India for nearly 30 years. And maybe most importantly, in a strange way, the judgment was so flawed that it forced a later generation of judges to build something much stronger and better in its place, the powerful, rights-focused framework we have today. And all of this leaves us with a question that's as real today as it was back in 1950. That tension between state security and individual freedom, it never goes away. The story of A.K. Gopalan is a powerful reminder that the line a democracy draws between them is never set in stone, and the debate over where exactly that line should be is one that every single generation has to have.